This day and time. What happened today, years ago.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping right into a really pivotal moment in the American Civil War.
That's right, the Battle of Seven Pines back in 1862.
And you've shared some great resources looking not just at the battle, but also, crucially, the change in command that happened right after.
Yeah, our goal here isn't just to recount the battle itself, which, tactically was kind of a draw.
Right.
We want to explore its deeper strategic impact, how it really paved the way for a new commander for the Confederates and shifted the whole direction of the war in the East.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How can a battle that's basically a stalemate have such massive strategic consequences?
Exactly. That's the question we want to dig into.
Okay, so let's set the scene. To really get Seven Pines, we need to look at the bigger picture first. The 1862 Peninsula Campaign.
Right. This was McClellan's big push for the Union. The idea was pretty ambitious. Sail troops down, land on the Virginia Peninsula, and march up to capture Richmond.
Bypass the main Confederate forces up north, strike right at the capital. A quick end to the war, that was the hope, wasn't it?
That was the plan, yeah. A major effort.
And facing this invasion, General Joseph E. Johnston, leading the Confederate Army there, the one that would later become famous as the Army of Northern Virginia.
And Johnston's initial response was, well, it caused some friction. He saw McClellan's larger numbers and decided the best strategy was a strategic retreat, pulling back up the peninsula towards Richmond.
Which didn't sit well with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
Not at all. Davis wanted a much more aggressive defense. He was pushing for Johnston to stand and fight further down the peninsula.
Yeah, that relationship between Johnston and Davis was already pretty tense, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. It wasn't just this one campaign. They clashed fundamentally on strategy. Johnston was cautious, Davis wanted bold action, plus there were issues over rank, and Davis, well, the sources really emphasize his basic distrust of Johnston.
Our sources mention Johnston being criticized for retreating rapidly.
Yeah.
And constant clashes over his cautious strategy. That distrust seems key.
It absolutely was. So as McClellan's army creeps forward, and McClellan was creeping, moving very slowly.
Right, he had his own issues with caution, didn't he? Overestimating Confederate strength, apparently.
Exactly. Faulty intelligence played a big part. But as McClellan advanced, Johnston kept falling back towards Richmond. And this just piled the pressure on Davis and the Confederate government. Their capital was looking increasingly threatened.
So you've got this backdrop of strategic disagreement, personal tension between the president and the general, and Johnston's retreat making Davis increasingly anxious. It feels like the stage was already set for a potential change in command, even before the battle.
I think that's very likely. Davis was probably already wondering about alternatives, given Johnston's perceived lack of, let's say, offensive spirit.
And Johnston getting wounded at Seven Pines was the moment, the catalyst.
Precisely. It was the event that forced the issue. But the underlying dissatisfaction was already there.
It's interesting, though, how McClellan's slowness actually gave Johnston time to gather his forces near Richmond.
It did. It inadvertently allowed the Confederates to concentrate, but it also left McClellan's own army in a tricky spot split by the Chickahominy River.
Ah, yes, the Chickahominy. That river played a big role. So part of the Union Army was south of the river, somewhat isolated.
Exactly. The 3rd and 4 Corps were south of the river, while the rest were north. And Johnston spotted this vulnerability.
And that was his plan for Seven Pines. Hit those isolated corps.
That was the core idea. Attack the 3rd and 4 Corps south of the river, overwhelm them before McClellan could get reinforcements across the swollen river to help.
It's like a decent plan on paper. Hit them while they're divided.
Strategically, it made sense. The objective was clear. Crush that exposed wing of the Union Army.
So what went wrong? The attack kicked off on May 31st.
Yeah, but it started badly. It was delayed by about 5 hours, which is a lifetime in a battle.
5 hours? Why?
Well, coordination was a huge problem. General Longstreet, who was supposed to be leading the main attack, apparently took the wrong road.
Took the wrong road. Seriously.
Seems so. And then General Huger, commanding another part of the force, reportedly got unclear orders. So instead of a coordinated assault, only some of the Confederate troops actually went into action initially. It was kind of piecemeal.
Wow. So the plan started falling apart almost immediately due to basic logistical issues.
Pretty much. Now, D.H. Hill's division did have some initial success. They hit General Casey's Union division pretty hard.
Pushed him back?
Yeah, they gained some ground initially, but the Union troops fought back hard and, crucially, reinforcements started to get across the river.
This is where Sumner's Corps comes in, right?
Yeah.
Crossing that shaky bridge.
Exactly. Sumner's to Second's Corps managed that incredibly risky crossing over the Grapevine Bridge. The river was flooded, the bridge was unstable, but they got across and helped shore up the Union line, a really critical moment.
So the fighting on the 31st sounds chaotic. Disconnected Confederate attacks, no decisive breakthrough.
Very chaotic, lots of confusion. Some Confederate units, according to the sources, never even got properly into position because of those initial mix-ups with roads and orders.
And then, amidst all this chaos, Johnston himself gets hit.
Late in the afternoon, yes. He was near the front lines and was seriously wounded, took a rifle bullet in the shoulder, and then got hit by artillery fragments in the chest.
A major blow. Wasn't there some story about him right before he was hit? Telling someone not to duck?
That's the one. Apparently he told an officer something like, "Colonel, it is useless to dodge. When you hear them, they've already passed." And then moments later, he was down. Just shows how close commanders were to the fighting.
Incredible. So Johnston's out of action. Who takes over?
Command passed temporarily to General Gustavus W. Smith.
G.W. Smith. And how did he do?
Well, he kept up the attacks on June 1st the next day, but they didn't achieve much. Reports suggest he seemed hesitant, maybe overwhelmed by the situation.
And President Davis was actually on the battlefield.
He was, witnessing the confusion and Smith's apparent indecisiveness firsthand, and that's when Davis made the change. He relieved Smith and appointed Robert E. Lee to command the army.
Wow, right there on the field. So, looking back at the 2 days of fighting, what was the verdict on Seven Pines itself?
Tactically, a bloody stalemate. Neither side really won a clear victory, but the cost was high.
What were the numbers?
The Union lost just over 5,000 men killed, wounded, missing. The Confederates actually lost more, over 6,100. Really heavy casualties for an inconclusive battle.
So the Confederate plan, hitting the divided Union Corps, it sounds like the idea was sound, but the execution failed.
That's exactly it. The failure wasn't really in Johnston's strategic thinking. The problem lay in command and control, communications, just getting everyone moving together.
The delays, the wrong roads, the vague orders.
All of that. The operational chaos on May 31st just torpedoed any chance of exploiting McClellan's divided army the way Johnston had envisioned.
But attacking those isolated corps, given the situation, was the right move.
Logically, yes. It was a sound strategic gamble based on the Union deployment south of the Chickahominy. But the Confederate Army at this stage just lacked the staff work and cohesion to pull off such a complex maneuver smoothly.
And Johnston being so close to the front.
Yeah.
Brave, maybe inspiring, but ultimately took him out of the picture at the worst possible time.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Hey.
His presence might have encouraged the men, but getting wounded created a command vacuum. Smith's temporary command didn't seem to stabilize things effectively on June 1st.
Which opened the door for Lee.
Exactly. It directly led to Davis making that decision to put Lee in charge.
Okay, so this is the moment. June 1st, 1862. Johnston's wounded, Smith's brief command is over, and Jefferson Davis appoints Robert E. Lee. This really feels like a hinge point.
It absolutely was. Lee takes command of what he officially names, right then, the Army of Northern Virginia.
And Lee had been Davis's military advisor just before this, right? So Davis knew him well.
Yeah, very well. Davis had direct insight into Lee's thinking, his capabilities. That advisory role was crucial.
What do you think Davis saw in Lee specifically for this crisis? Richmond's defenses needed shoring up. McClellan was close.
Well, Lee's engineering background was definitely a plus for the defenses. But I think Davis also sensed Lee had a more dynamic, maybe aggressive leadership style compared to Johnston. Especially with the enemy practically at the gates, Davis needed someone proactive.
Do you think Davis was maybe grooming Lee for a top command anyway, and this just forced his hand?
It's quite possible. Lee was highly respected, despite a recent setback. But the urgency of the situation Richmond threatened, Johnston down made Lee the obvious available choice right then and there.
Let's talk about Lee's record up to this point. He had a great reputation from the old Army, Mexican War.
Top of his class at West Point, distinguished service, yes, but his first major Confederate field command.
In Western Virginia.
Right. That ended pretty poorly with a defeat at Sheep Mountain in '61. He actually got criticized for being too timid, believe it or not. Granny Lee, some apparently called him then.
So, he wasn't exactly riding a wave of battlefield glory when he took over this crucial army.
Not at all. After Sheep Mountain, he worked on coastal defenses, then came back to Richmond as Davis's advisor, a role he apparently found frustrating, feeling he had little influence. So yeah, he stepped into this huge command with a somewhat tarnished recent Confederate record.
And the name, Army of Northern Virginia.
You said Lee officially named it on day one.
Yes, Special Order Number 22, June 1st. The name had been floating around informally, but Lee made it official. It sounds like a small thing maybe, but it helped forge a real identity for that army.
Beyond the name, what did Lee do immediately? How did he signal things were changing?
He moved fast. He started reorganizing things, tightening discipline. He put his engineering skills to work, ordering massive improvements to Richmond's fortifications, digging trenches, building earthworks.
Getting the defenses ready. Absolutely. But also looking after the soldiers, improving food supply, ensuring rest, and crucially, stepping up intelligence gathering, figuring out exactly where McClellan was and what he was doing. He also started consolidating forces. Later, after the 7 days, he'd make bigger changes, creating the core structure under Longstreet and Jackson.
It sounds like a shift from Johnston's more reactive defensive approach. Lee was thinking offense, wasn't he?
Immediately. He didn't believe Richmond could be saved just by sitting behind defenses and waiting for McClellan, who had a bigger army, to attack. Lee believed the only way to save the capital was to seize the initiative.
So he starts planning an attack almost right away.
Yes. He began planning the operations that would become the 7 days battles, fought later that month, June 25th to July 1st. The goal was clear: drive McClellan away from Richmond aggressively.
How did the soldiers react to this new energy, this new commander?
Morale definitely got a boost. There was a sense of renewed confidence, purpose. Lee's leadership felt more decisive, more energetic. The sources talk about a transformation through judicious personnel and organizational changes combined with improved operational planning. He started molding the army.
Going back to Davis's choice, appointing Lee despite Cheat Mountain still feels like a gamble. What was Davis thinking, weighing that risk?
It was a calculated risk, for sure, but Davis likely banked on Lee's fundamental qualities, his long pre-war reputation, his clear strategic mind that Davis saw firsthand in the advisory role. The immediate threat to Richmond was immense. Maybe Davis felt he needed potential greatness, even if it came with recent failure.
And maybe Lee's style seemed a better fit for what Davis wanted compared to Johnston's caution.
Quite possibly. Davis, while generally favoring a strategic defense for the Confederacy, wasn't opposed to bold offensive moves when the opportunity arose. He might have seen that potential in Lee. Plus, Lee's engineering skills for the immediate defense of Richmond were undeniably valuable. It was probably a mix of trusting Lee's core abilities and hoping his leadership would blossom under the pressure of high command.
So Lee steps in, and immediately things change. Fortifications, logistics, intelligence, and planning an offensive. It's a total shift in mindset.
A profound shift, yeah. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was actively trying to dictate the terms of the campaign, to take back the initiative from McClellan. It was a complete contrast to how the campaign had been managed under Johnston. This immediate assertion of a new dynamic approach set the stage directly for the 7 days.
And that decision to formally name the Army, Army of Northern Virginia, more than just admin.
Oh, definitely. It was psychologically important. It gave the Army a distinct identity, an esprit de corps. It wasn't just Johnston's army anymore, or the generic army defending Richmond. It became the Army of Northern Virginia.
Creating a sense of belonging, maybe pride?
Exactly. And resilience. That name became iconic, legendary. It established a regional identity, and aspiration Northern Virginia suggested a broader claim, not just holding Richmond. It laid the groundwork for the intense loyalty and fighting spirit that army became famous for. It was part of Lee forging that force into his army.
So let's pull back. Seven Pines itself, a messy, costly stalemate on the ground.
Tactically, yes, inconclusive.
But its real importance comes from Johnston being wounded and Lee taking command.
That's the key takeaway. That change in command directly led to the 7 days battle just a few weeks later.
And in the 7 days, Lee managed to push McClellan back from Richmond.
Right.
Even if it wasn't always perfectly executed.
Right. Lee's attacks during the 7 days were often complex, sometimes poorly coordinated too, and Confederate casualties were very high. But strategically, he achieved his objective. McClellan's huge army was forced to retreat, the siege of Richmond was broken, and the Peninsula Campaign ended in failure for the Union. The capital was saved.
And this really cemented Lee's reputation and the Army's identity.
Absolutely. Lee's arrival marked a massive turning point. He took an army that seemed on the back foot and turned it into arguably the Confederacy's most effective weapon. His boldness, his tactical skill, even though controversial because of the casualties, allowed the Confederacy to punch above its weight in the East for years. Saving Richmond in '62 dramatically prolonged the war.
So it really is this paradox. Seven Pines, the indecisive battle, becomes one of the most strategically vital battles of the early war because it brought Lee to command.
Precisely. You have to wonder, if Johnston hadn't been wounded then, would Lee have stayed an advisor? Gotten some other command? It might have taken much longer for him to get this top spot. Our sources basically say the battle itself was of little significance other than Johnston being replaced by Lee. Another notes, Johnston's wounding profoundly affected the war, leading directly to Lee's appointment.
It really highlights the role of contingency, of almost chance in history. A stray bullet changes everything.
And considering Lee's mixed record just before this, it seems unlikely he would have gotten this command unless something dramatic happened, like the current commander being incapacitated right when the capital was under direct threat. It took that crisis to elevate him so decisively.
And Lee's later success built directly on this moment, shaping his legacy, the whole lost cause idea.
Immensely. His ability to turn things around right after Seven Pines, to save Richmond when things looked bleak, became central to his legend and the lost cause narrative. That story of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat.
It created this powerful image of Confederate resilience, didn't it?
Exactly. The Army of Northern Virginia became a symbol of the Confederate nation, and Lee the ultimate symbol of the lost cause. That whole enduring legacy really kicks off with the dramatic turnaround that started the moment he took command in June 1862, thanks to the events at Seven Pines.
So the big takeaway: Seven Pines, tactically messy, strategically profound. It wasn't the fighting itself, but the consequence. Johnston out, Lee in that reshaped the war in the East.
That's the heart of it.
It leaves you with a fascinating thought, though. If Johnston hadn't been wounded at Seven Pines, how different might the next few years of the Civil War have looked?
It's impossible to know, of course, but it really makes you consider that butterfly effect in history, doesn't it? How one event, one person in the right or wrong place can change everything.
Definitely food for thought. A reminder of how complex these historical moments are and the huge impact of leadership. Thanks for walking us through this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more history daily.